Hello, everyone. We'll start. Thank you for joining this crucial conversation. Dear leaders of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we'll try to answer the following question. How can we create the framework condition for a desirable future? Today, as we gather here, there are 3 important points that will guide us. Number 1, according to science, we are not at the right speed. We are not at the right speed. We stand at the precipice, having already breached 6 planetary boundaries. If you care about climate change, think about the fact that other planetary boundaries are even worse. Number 2, there is no planet B, nor a desirable future for business or humanity on a planet push 1.5 or 2 degree threshold. The urgency of our action cannot be overstated. We have to succeed by working together and by building bridges. Number 3, be brave and bold. These are not my words, but words from Patrick Audier at the launch event. It is through collaborative determination and audacity that we can hope to navigate the challenge ahead. Before we embark on this transformative session, let us take a moment to reflect upon exemplars of humanity of what we can achieve at the finest. One example of government initiative with regulation. In France, 2 years ago, Article 29 made mandatory not only climate reporting, but also reporting on biodiversity. This move catalyzed a significant section of French financial actors to become early adopters of biodiversity data, setting a promising precedent. Corporate initiative. In the realm of voluntary action, we find inspiring alliances, such as the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, exemplifying how industry leaders can unite in their commitment to sustainability. Supervision. Regulatory bodies such as the EBA are adapting, introducing new capital rules linked to the transition pathway of banks. And finally, citizen. The recent vote in Ecuador, where citizens chose to halt voluntary oil drilling in the Amazon rainforest, demonstrates the impact of collective decision-making on our shared destiny. That being said, let me now introduce to you our leaders of today and tomorrow. So, on my left, there is Myriam Staub-Bisson, who is head BlackRock Switzerland at BlackRock. Thank you for joining us today and participating. Then we have Christophe Baumann, Envoy of Sustainable Finance, Swiss State Secretariat for International Finance, Switzerland. Then we have Jill Lofts, thank you for coming as well, from EY, Global Finance Services Sustainable Finance Leader. Then we have Gavich Wagner, ESG Methodology and Product Manager at Julius Baer. And then we have David Bastia-Jarros, a fellow for Center for Finance and Development at the Graduate Institute Geneva, and member of the Platform on Sustainable Finance and co-founder of SwissX. And myself, so Melissa Perez, and Head of Sales and Business Development at Carbon for Finance, a climate and biodiversity data provider. So now that we are all introduced, let me now present the agenda of the session of today. So we'll have a few questions for you because we care about your point of view about this topic. So we'll ask to you actually 3 questions, and you can already take your smartphone because you will need to go to Slido. Then we'll have an introductory keynote by, I would say, our 2 experts on regulation. So David and Christophe will a bit state the landscape of what is going on in Europe and in Switzerland, so we can all start from the same technical standpoints. Then we'll have the shared views of Myriam, Jill, and Gavich on the topic of their point of view about what is the creating framework conditions, so what has happened before, what is their, I will say, day-to-day point of view about this topic. And on the second part, we'll talk about it more from a prospective point of view. What can we think about this topic positively? What can we build? What is already done in a leader industry? We talked about it with BlackRock, for example. And of course, we'll take your question. So if you're all ready, we'll now go to the Slido with the first question. So you can all connect. The first question that will be asked to you I will read it, but anyway, you will see it on the Slido part. To head toward a sustainable world, how much do you think governmental regulation is needed as opposed to self-regulation by the market? If you answer 1, it means that you do not believe I would say you believe more in self-regulation than regulation, and 5 is the opposite. Thank you for your very quick answer. We'll wait a few seconds. So it's quite a balanced point of view, apparently, from the audience. So you are 57. We'll reach maybe 60, and then we'll go. Okay. Maybe we can go now to the second question. Do you think the EU is doing enough in terms of regulation to nudge the financial market to become more sustainable for climate, biodiversity, and people? So, it's changing a lot, so that's quite interesting. We'll wait as well for 60 people at minimum to answer it. Okay. Now we'll go to the third question. Do you think Switzerland is doing enough in terms of regulation to nudge the financial markets to become more sustainable for climate, biodiversity, and people? So 40 people, will wait a bit. And maybe you can ask yourself this question after this session and maybe see if your point of view changed or not. Okay, very interesting. So now I would like to let David introduce to us a bit a landscape of EU regulation. So the floor is yours. Yeah, you can go there as you want.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for this kind introduction, and really kudos to all of you for staying at this very difficult slot. It's 5 to 6:30. I mean, it only proves how important this topic is. So thank you to Building Bridges for bringing it up, and thank you to my co-panelists. I will start with presenting the case for regulatory top-bottom kind of approach that we are facing and that we are trying to get going in the EU, which is probably the second largest financial market, a reform that will have wide implications, also intended, sometimes unintended, and the spillover effects of this regulatory approach will be severe. And what I understand afterwards, we're going to have a case presented by Christoph, who's a good friend, and we had a couple of those discussions already going on, and I think we are really at the beginning of an amazing natural experiment, right? Like two different approaches to tackle the same problem, and I think that the jury is still out and deciding on how it's going to end, right? I think before I start, I don't think that neither of the approaches is perfect and complete, and we are just at the beginning of this road. So I'm really also very much excited to see how it's gonna end. But before we're gonna talk about how it's gonna end, let's start how it started. And I feel a little bit like an imposter here because I have Nancy here who has been a veteran of this reform, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm only in this process for past 3 years, and she has been there at the beginning. But at least from my perspective, the whole reform started very much as a small project of voluntary people passionate about sustainable finance who really wanted to tackle greenwashing. and create something that will allow us to distinct between what is green without necessarily red listing or black listing or brown listing anything that is bad. We really wanted to understand what is sustainable in financial markets. And this is how it started. It started as a result of all the problems that we've been discussing here for past day and a half, maybe two, which is lack of standardized taxonomy, lack of, we're not able to compare apples to apples, we don't speak the same language, we are using different metrics, etc., etc. This discussion has been going on for probably 15 to 20 years, and as a result of that, the idea of taxonomy has been created. As a result also of a failure of some frameworks that we are using, like, let's say, maybe not a failure, but shortcoming or misuse of the ESG framework, right? ESG has been booming for many years, yet we don't see necessarily the positive outcome of the framework, and we also recognize that it attracts a lot of greenwashing efforts. And to tackle that, this idea of the sustainable finance reform has been introduced and landed on, as Miriam told me, reminded me, on the Juncker's desk, and has been swiftly adopted by the Commission, European Commission, that we are working on right now. So the humble beginning was sort of based on voluntary measure, as I mentioned before, technological neutrality, evidence and research-based criteria that were supposed to be created for every economic activity in the EU that has impact on climate, on biodiversity, on pollution, water, etc., etc. So the idea was to first force all major companies to start using taxonomy as a tool to report their climate impact. But you cannot finish just there. At the same time, you need to force financial market participants, like money investors, to start using the scores that the company have been reporting to calculate how sustainable their financial products are. And another push was towards banks, and to try to force them, maybe this is too strong of the word, but kindly ask, using regulatory framework, if I may, to show how green and how sustainable their portfolios are. So just to use a very practical and simple example, you take a cement company and you ask them to report how much of their turnover today meets the sustainability criteria. Sustainability criteria have been defined by the group of specialists that were based on scientific research, on the evidence that was available to us. And taxonomy is basically a very, very long document that defines what production of sustainable production of cement is. And if you as a company are your process of producing cement meets those criteria, then the turnover that is meeting the criteria is considered sustainable. And you have a score, a simple to interpret score, we call it KPI, that says that, for example, 50% of this particular company is taxonomy aligned. That basically can translate into let's say, opinion that this company is 50% sustainable. And that score, we also ask them to report how much of their CapEx and OpEx is taxonomy aligned. And this tool is being used to simply make a distinction between the companies that are investing in change, in transition, and to show how much of their CapEx is indeed sustainable or aligned with the with the taxonomy, and we take those numbers, and then financial market participants, money investors, asset managers, banks can take those numbers and simply see how much of their portfolio is being invested in that company, and you result in, again, a quite simple and straightforward number that tells you how sustainable my portfolio is. So that was the idea. And it sounds simple and straightforward. Of course, as every policy, especially of this magnitude, it turned out to face a lot of challenges, and I think that we will be talking about those challenges a lot today. Of course, it faced political pressures. It is a costly reform, costly for the system. The companies that needed to implement it needed to invest in additional staff to simply get the data points that sometimes they didn't even know they have. So we are asking a lot. We're asking a lot to the real economy companies. We're asking a lot to financial market participants to fulfill and answer tons of questions. But isn't it exactly what we've been asking for from the beginning? The data points that are comparable across the universe. Again, this is not a done deal, and we are on a path to improve the reform every day. There are a lot of challenges ahead of us. The transitional finance, the green bonds, making taxonomy usable is where the focus of everyone is right now. Making data concise. You know, if you look at what one data provider is telling us about the same company in comparison to 3 other data providers, you will find some shocking differences. We definitely need to put much more effort into training, explanation, and also everyone needs to stay open to feedback from rooms like yours. So this is a very, very short introduction. Hopefully I made the time about EU taxonomy and regulatory approach to reforming sustainable finance. Yeah, let's take it away. Thank you.
So now we will continue with Christophe. If you can share your views on Switzerland.
Since it's after 5, I'll just keep sitting.
I agree, that's okay.
So I think that the main thing to understand in the difference of approaches between the European Union and Switzerland is that the European Union has a main focus on the activity level of assets to determine what's a green activity, has some focus on the corporate level, so on an entity level, and so far less focus on a portfolio level overall, but the main focus is on activity, and that's very useful in itself as well. While Switzerland believes focus is more productive for financial markets by having a focus on corporates and on the portfolios itself. So that's, I think, 2 big differences. And I would hold that the taxonomy is doing a lot of things good, but not as a basis for transparency in the financial market, or at least not the way it's implemented now. So there's some, you always have to look at the incentives it creates, but very happy to be challenged on that. We have a lot of discussions on that all the time. So let me give you an introduction of what Switzerland is doing, and the case I want to make is that we're not all self-regulation. There's a lot of very innovative regulation in place, maybe not sufficiently. We are constantly trying to improve also the regulatory framework. And the other thing to remember is also when we talk of self-regulation, that's actually regulation, the way we understand it, because it's mandatory for financial institutions. It's just developed by the associations. So I think a better way to differentiate is then having like no regulation or self-regulation and regulation, but that's a detail. So the main, I think, law relevant for us over the coming years is the law that's been passed or through the popular vote this summer, the Climate and Innovation Law. There are 3 global firsts in there. So we are, first of all, the first country in the world who has the net zero 2050 adopted by the population. Second, we are the only country who has in law that each and every company needs to be net zero with scope 1, scope 2 by 2050. So it's not just a government target, it's on each and every company the obligation. Third, we are the only country where the government is, with Article 9.1, mandated to ensure that the financial market is not just Paris aligned, so aligned with Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, but actually also contributes to climate mitigation. Whatever that means, that's now a big topic for the future, but we're the only country who has done these three things. It's important to remember. Another key regulation for us, and there we're very much aligned with what the EU has been doing and also what the UK and others have been doing, is making climate disclosures similar to the EU with a double materiality mandatory for larger companies. So we currently have copied NFRD from the European Union and added a TCFD, so a Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, ordinance on top of that. And 2 weeks ago, I'm not sure if you've heard already, David, the Federal Council decided that we want to close the gaps from NFRD to CSRD. So when it comes to the two main gaps are the scope, so also non-listed companies should be covered and also smaller companies. And the second, which is, in my opinion, key, is the assurance part of it, which is a key development by the European Union. So this ordinance is key, and one of the key aspects of it is transition plans. There we didn't go into detail, we just said you need to have a transition plan, scope 1 to scope 3, but we leave it up to the companies to determine what's a science-based transition plan, what's a best practice. There I'm looking especially across the channel to the UK. The Transition Plan Task Force is doing tremendous work, and I believe over the next 2 or 3 years there will be also international emerging best practices on transition plans. Also the CSDD goes in that direction. The other part, which as Switzerland, and now I'm leaving the era of hard regulation, but where Switzerland is doing important work is, I believe, with the Paris alignment, climate alignment tests, so the PACTA tests, which we've been running since 2017. So since 2017, on a voluntary basis, but we cover 80% of the market, so there's no real need to go on a mandatory basis when you have such a coverage. We measure each 2 years how the financial market, so pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, and banks, how they're aligned with the Paris Agreement, where the gaps are. And this gives us a really nice way to see where there's progress and where there's not. And there's clear progress in some areas, in others there's no. So it really gives, informs our policy making nicely, and we clearly intend to continue with that. A key area where Switzerland hasn't done anything so far except self-regulation, so the industry has made self-regulation on greenwashing, but the Swiss government has so far not implemented any regulation on greenwashing. We've published a position by the Federal Council in December, and the position is very, very simple and I believe common sense. What's sustainable is if your investment has an impact to any sustainability goal you can choose, and you can measure the way you want to choose, but be transparent on how you measure it, and then the market can decide if that was a good way of measuring it, or if it's aligned with any sustainability goal. But if it doesn't have, if it neither has an impact nor it's aligned, it just merely mitigates financial risks in your portfolio, that's also important. That's your fiduciary duty to do so. But don't call it sustainable because it's not contributing or at least aligned with sustainability goal. It's a very similar direction or almost the identical direction that the FCA in the UK is taking, and I'm also encouraged with some developments in the EU in that direction as well. I'll close with a beautiful example of where the government, industry, and NGOs and universities can work together to really do something I believe unique, and that's the establishing transparency on the Paris alignment on financial products and mandates. So we had a lot of pressure from Parliament and from NGOs saying you need to make climate transparency mandatory. And I answered then honestly and said, okay, I give you the book, you draft regulation, what's the KPIs, what's the transparency you want? And there they didn't have an opinion. So, and the same with the industry, it wasn't clear what's good transparency to measure alignment with Paris. It's a complex question. You look 27 years in the future on some of the aspects. So what we did is we established a working group with the industry, with academia and NGOs, and over 1 year we established the climate scores, which we published last summer, and we're now doing a revision for this autumn. And I really believe it's a very, very good consensus on best practice transparency with Paris alignment. It's a voluntary measure, but I'm very encouraged with the signals that many of the large financial institutions will roll them out this winter. I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thank you for ending with a positive note. So I will now ask Miriam. We had a lot of discussion when we prepared this roundtable about regulation and also like the role of actors such as BlackRock. So the first question for you will be how BlackRock is or not influencing regulation. So that will be for me the first question for you.
Yes, and thank you for the question, but really thanks to all of you for listening to us here in this graveyard slot. How is BlackRock influencing regulation? I think it's a good question because while we're speaking to regulators and to lawmakers in the context of all lawmaking, we are not. We don't feel it's our role to actually make law. That's the rule of the policymakers, the lawmakers, and when we're asked to opine on what we feel that a good law or good regulation should look like, we do so, and we speak to regulators, but we don't see it as our role. And here I kind of like to take a look back over the last couple of years when large asset managers like BlackRock actually took a very prominent role in advancing transparency of corporates on climate risks. We came out a couple of years ago with the firm belief that climate risks and sustainability risks are investment risk, and hence asked the companies we invest in. And as the world's largest index investors, we own 5 to say 7% of most companies' shares globally, larger company shares globally. So we engage with those companies as shareholders and ask them to provide transparency on their climate risks on the one hand, but then also tell us how they plan to mitigate those risks. We feel as representatives of all our clients, as fiduciary investors, we felt it's important that our clients and we as their representatives, as their stewards, actually know what these climate risks are that our clients hold in their portfolios. So while transparency on climate risks wasn't like on everybody's radar as much as it is today, perhaps it actually triggered or accelerated the regulators to kind of go ahead and do their job and establish the policies and regulations related to the transparency of climate risks.
Thank you very much for sharing your view. Speaking of you, I think it's very interesting because we are speaking about data, about transparency, about data quality, and I want to talk to our experts today on that topic. So Gerbish, can you tell us from your expertise point of view, what is possible to be done today with current data and methodology that are available externally or internally? If you can share your view on that topic, please.
Yeah, so in my current role, every day I work on making sure that we can classify instruments as sustainable, responsible, or traditional. Since last year, the EU requires us to ask our clients what their ESG preferences are, which in general is a very smart way to start engaging clients on the topic. However, the question has become very complex. Not only do we need to ask the proportion of the investments that need to be invested sustainably, conform a specific definition, we also need ask the client to which degree its portfolio needs to be taxonomy aligned. So the topic has already been discussed, but it's very technical and hard to explain, especially because it's on an economic activity level, not on a company level. And we have a concept that we need to ask our clients to which degree the portfolio needs to be invested in instruments that do no significant harm. And in general, the EU left a lot of room for the industry to define what that means. So what is sustainable? You have some guiding principles. You need to contribute to a social and environmental objective, follow good governance, and do no significant harm. Well, at Julius Baer, we have a very large offering, so we need to have a data-driven model to be able to do this classification. So what we have done is we have data from different providers, which we combine into different thematic scores. We have a climate score, a governance score, a human capital score, and a few others. And in that way, we can very transparently communicate to our clients why we deem a company sustainable or not. We have the discussion, this company is great in governance, it has great human capital performance, but from a climate perspective, it's lacking. With our own methodology, we are able to weigh different data points that we deem important. A company that has fossil fuel exposures, but on the other hand, also a large degree of taxonomy-aligned revenue, we feel that that company, if the differentiate or the percentages are right, can very well classify as a responsible investment because it's moving and transitioning towards a greener economy. Also within our methodology, we're able to classify or to determine rules, what to do in case we miss certain data points. There is a lot of data, but not all companies report on all the different aspects yet. So from that perspective, it's great that the EU is pushing for more transparency and reporting so we get more standardized data. But until we're there, we have to face the fact we don't have data on all data points. We want to have, as a bank, a methodology that we can explain to the client on different team scores, that the client can make an intelligent decision and really add value in the decision-making process. Within the regulation, however, they have certain aspects that are not clearly defined. So there's regulatory ambiguity. And that's especially on the do no significant harm element. And that makes it very difficult to be sure that what we're doing is actually in line with the regulatory expectations. So they have defined 14 different data points, which you need to consider. As Julius Baer, we have integrated these different data points in our scores. But in case we don't have a certain data point, it doesn't mean we cannot classify it as sustainable if we have sufficient other data points to come to that conclusion. In one of the regulatory hearings of the European supervisory authorities, they actually seemed to indicate that in case you don't have data on certain of these data points, you do not have to sell it as sustainable, which is fair enough, but the goal is to reallocate capital to sustainable investments. On some of these data points, if you look at our universe, only 4% of corporates report on them at the moment. So only those 4 would be able to be classified as sustainable. And are we then really investing in the most sustainable companies or in those that report the best?
Very interesting question. Maybe we can take on that on the second part. Gian, to continue this conversation with the different point of views, can you tell us a bit about your experience and maybe your point of view about the question we asked to the audience at the end, like regulation versus self-regulation versus no regulation?
Yes, with pleasure, thank you. So I'll start off by saying, from our experience of working in the market and also a recent survey we did of 500 corporates globally, we see that the focus from a sustainability perspective of companies is on 3 areas: regulatory compliance, industry standards or voluntary commitments, and clearly in the case of financial services, we would see that as GFAN's net zero decarbonisation. And then the third area is product and service innovation. And I think regulation and government has a role to play across all 3 of those dimensions. I've got some stats for you here. There are according to our research, over 1,700 ESG guidelines, over 600 frameworks, and over 360 standards and regs. I thought there were 20 taxonomies globally. I bumped into somebody a couple of weeks ago who reckoned there was 30. So talking about this complexity is huge. I think the transparency question is super important, because the more that firms can report and disclose, the better the data is for everybody. Now, let me give you some stats on that. From the work that we've done, CSRD needs 4,700 KPIs and TCFD 1,700. So these are hugely complex projects. I worked on a non-financial disclosures project in 2016. It was a global project, and we had an amazing board of very experienced people on this topic. And one of the things that they advised us at the time, and this is one of the things I think it's important to get right, is go step by step. If you go too fast, you could make way too many errors. So that's one thing. Now, what is the right speed? Who knows? Because at the moment, we're in the critical decade. So that's really crucial. But I think, you know, if you look at financial reporting, then that's been around for something like 180 years. It's still open to interpretation. It's still open to subjectivity. And we're just moving into the first year of CSRD reporting. So I'm not saying that I think regulation should go slow, and I'm not saying that FS should go slow, but I think that this is a hugely complex issue that, you know, we all do need to work together. I thought Christian's comments were superb around, and we have looked at lots of different markets around the world. And different countries clearly have different ambitions in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Some that I've spoken to want to attract the most transition finance that they possibly can across the whole globe of investors. Others, and that's probably, it was the UK up until recently, I don't know if it still is, wanted to be, you know, the sustainable finance hub of the world. So I think working between industry, between governments, between scientists, and between the real economy is absolutely critical, whether you're going to move the regulatory agenda forward or actually the sort of self-regulatory agenda.
Christophe, you wanted to comment? Or
No, I fully agree with the comments you made. And I was just thinking about the comment you made about the UK. It's also... when you look at sustainable finance hubs, a lot is also dependent on how you communicate. I think sustainable finance has become, there's quite some marketing aspects of it. And I give one example because you mentioned the UK. I remember being with our State Secretary for International Finance, Danielle Stoffel, in Glasgow at COP26. And Finance Day was dominated by Rishi Sunak's we make transition plans mandatory for financial institutions. And and everyone was talking about it was the big achievement of Finance Day. And I was looking at Daniela and I told her, well, it's weird because this morning I put it in the ordinance that will put in effect, but we just didn't do such a show. So sometimes it's difficult. I understand when, for instance, when Switzerland, when international community thinks sometimes Switzerland is not moving fast enough on some regulation. Well, on some we actually are, but you just don't notice. That's also sometimes a difference of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And from some of the work we've done, Christian, we've seen exactly that. It's about bringing together, but then how do you brand that and how do you get your message out? I totally agree.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add, Jill, something on how do we can work together, because it's the theme of building bridges? So have you example of inspiring example of how we can create the good condition for maybe a better framework or that you might have seen?
So I think, well, I'm going to pick kind of a couple of things that I think need work, right? You've obviously mentioned transition plans. At the moment, from what we see, there is no transition taxonomy in the EU. I think some countries are thinking about it. Well,
yeah, and on the right, a lot of work on it.
But and GFANs have a template, but a lot of firms have created their own transition framework. to define what transition finance means in their own businesses, to apply the policies, who are they going to lend to, invest and insure, under what conditions, what monitoring processes they put in place, and all those kind of things. So I feel that is one area where we could work together further. I think mobilization of finance, and that was talked about a lot yesterday. Again, financial services will take commercial risk. And again, as it was said yesterday, there's a role for public financing, for donors, etc. So how do you help to mobilize financial services around transition and around sustainability to a greater extent? I think that would be another key area. And then I think just two more, and it's sort of related. So nature and biodiversity, which again, I think probably need to look at that in more detail. What can we do? What does it look like? How do you make it impactful, financial services? And then again, talked about yesterday, just transition and the social impact of what's doing. So when we look at a lot of firms' decarbonisation plans, and of course I'm generalising, the thinking around biodiversity and nature is quite immature, as is the thinking around just transition and social impact.
Thank you very much. We were talking about what we can do, and that's the object of the second part of the conversation. You can feel it. It's more about innovation, how we can work together, what is already done. And when we discussed earlier, we discussed a bit about so which role is taking BlackRock on this topic. And I shared a quote when we prepared this presentation. It's from Churchill. So where there is great power, there is also great responsibility. And I heard a quite good news about innovative way of also bringing value to your shareholders and clients on this topic.
Yes, and thank you. I think it's really important aspect that we're hopefully going to discuss today. So where there's great power, there's a lot of responsibility. I think we have to be careful that in the case of BlackRock, we don't mistake size, just for power. BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager, but as all these assets are not our assets, but actually the assets are our client, and we only act as a steward and as a fiduciary of those assets, we actually are bound to do whatever we do and move in a very kind of narrow swim line, which is guided by our fiduciary duty. And as I said before, our fiduciary duty is again guided by our belief that climate risks are investment risks among other investment risks, and so we try to take that into account in everything we do, be that on the investment side, but also on the stewardship side when we engage with companies. Now, what we're doing for clients is important in the sense that, again, whatever we try to do, we try to put ourselves in the shoes of the client and start with the client and provide choice to the client. And it's not only about choosing what kind of investments they want to do and provide a large choice in investment products, be they sustainable or non-sustainable, because there's many people, our clients, other people's clients, that may not want to invest with a sustainability objective. So we take that into account and provide this choice. But an innovation we came forward with in the last 12 months is actually on voting. So normally our clients, institutional clients, they can give us a mandate and they can either tell us whether they want us to exercise their votes for them according to our stewardship principles, or they decide to do it themselves. Now, we're seeing that some also buyers, owners of our fund products, our ETF products, they actually would like to exercise their votes and express their opinions on certain aspects that are being voted on in General Assemblies. So now we are providing voting choice on about 40% of all our equity assets have now this voting choice where clients can exercise their opinion on topics that are being voted on in General Assemblies. And we're seeing a good uptake on that voting choice, but we also see that many clients, despite having that choice, they actually decide to give their votes to us to exercise them because they understand we have a big team, we have the world's largest stewardship team, that is in line with their investment interests. So it's another choice we provide, but not everybody is taking advantage of that.
I think personally it's very interesting to let people choose, and then we'll see anyway what they want to do, because at the end of the day it's your client but their money as well. And it's also the question of pedagogy that all financial actors can also provide to their clients to provide a better information on what matters as well, and then it's the choice of everyone. Maybe coming back on the data part and the dream of what we can do tomorrow, I will come back to Gabrish about what is your view, again, as a methodological expert, about your ideal framework or what you think could be helping for your daily job to provide maybe better recommendation, better products according to what your clients are expecting?
Yeah, I think it also comes back to the transition again. Within the current definition of a sustainable investment, we can invest in companies that are sustainable, which is great. But if we really want to make an impact, we need to invest in those companies that are high emitters, but that are on a good trajectory. Like those companies are actually actively reducing their emissions. For that, you need to have a different categorization, an impact categorization. And for that, to be able to do that, we need to drop that do no significant harm element and create a different category where we can invest in those companies that are, from a climate perspective, for example, high emitters, but where we clearly engage with companies, that we have discussions, what are your transition plans, that we set KPIs, and accordingly also be transparent on how we measure the KPIs and the activities that will follow if a company doesn't meet certain KPIs. But for that, the definition that is currently there in the EU really needs to change. And what I think it's also important that we keep the client in mind. As I already mentioned, we need to ask our clients on 3 different preferences. The taxonomy one sounds maybe straightforward. To what degree do you want to have investments that are taxonomy aligned? But taxonomy alignment is on economic activity level. So a company can have 20% taxonomy alignment or 80%. So then the follow-up question is already, for you as an investor, when do you deem a company sufficiently taxonomy aligned to be considered taxonomy aligned in your portfolio? So you either need to have that follow-up question, or you apply a portfolio weighting approach, but then the meaning of the number becomes already much harder to interpret. So simplicity is also key. We need to be able to explain to our clients what we're doing. We have good reasons for it, but we also need to ensure we don't overly complicate things.
Thank you. I think Christophe, maybe?
Yes, I took personal offense by what my colleague said. You said that the current definition on sustainable investments prevents you to make an actual impact investment in the secondary market. And you afterwards corrected yourself and said that's in the EU, because I wanted to correct you and say that the Swiss position on greenwashing perfectly allows you to, when you have the intention to have an impact, to classify it as sustainable investments. If you afterwards show why you think it has an impact, you show the channel of change, and you report afterwards on that change. So I think there we feel we made something that aligns with how the market defines impact and alignment.
Yeah, I think it's indeed, it is currently, our work is a lot driven by EU regulation. We want to have one definition that is across the world equally. And the EU so far has the most stringent standards. But luckily also the EU seems to have seen or recognized this limitation. So in the current process of the revision of the SFDR, which is driving this definition, they also already in the consultation seem to open up room for transition financing.
Thank you very much. Maybe David, yeah?
So just a couple of words on transition finance, and going back to your point about how many data points we're talking about and how heavy this regulation is on market participants. This is, we believe, the main reason why we didn't progress with the transitional finance the way we wanted, but the work has been done. So there is a very, very strong paper and framework designed by the Platform on Sustainable Finance under the leadership of Nancy, who's here, and I hope that Nancy in the later part of the session you will tell us more about it. That really provides a very strong framework, and we're really all looking forward to start implementing it. But as you said, it takes time, and you cannot just overload the market with data points and new classification. It takes time for this to simply get into the blood of the system.
I completely agree, and I think, like I say, this is a hot topic for financial services. How do we progress transition finance? Now, sustainable finance is also a hot topic because we need to mobilize more capital and investment and insurance to sustainability. But for a lot of firms, transition is probably, 80%, 85% of their portfolio. So this is a really hot topic in the industry.
And to your point, the transitional finance as an asset class will be so much larger than sustainable assets only, right? I mean, if you really introduce and look at the market and check how many companies are meeting, let's say sustainable taxonomy alignment above, let's say 50%. Yeah. I mean, those numbers are small, right? So the transitional finance is actually, this is what we need to do right, because if we make a mistake there, it will just be a gate for massive greenwashing. So that's why we really need to put in the work on that asset class.
Okay. Maybe we'll make one more. I have one more question actually for the panel, and then we'll go for you. So prepare your question if you have some. It will be for you in the next minutes. We talked a lot about speed. At the same time, we know that in terms of the way we advance in terms of planetary boundaries, we are going too fast, actually. And in the other way, it seems that we are going too slowly in the way we are working. So I'm quite interested in a bit brainstorming, and if some have ideas on the room, don't hesitate to raise your hand. But how can we at the same time go slower and faster? Should we make very little step, but very, very quick, maybe? And maybe I just wanted also to jump on the example that you explained, Christophe, on the way you work with NGOs, because I think maybe we are losing a lot of time because we maybe sometimes don't work enough together at the start of all of projects. So I wanted to ask you maybe if you can share a bit how it worked when you work with NGOs and apparently other stakeholders on the Swiss climate score. Was it a way to make it quicker maybe if you can share your lesson about that.
Since our focus at the climate scores is really to have an international best practice, so we're not inventing individual indicators ourselves, but we have an international view on what's the best part of GFANS for transparency on financial products, what's the best part of SBTI and other and TCFD and key other initiatives. And for that, the more internationally adept stakeholders that are on board, the better. And our engagement with the large financial institutions and associations has been really very productive. The same with the academics. They've challenged a lot of positions very well. And the same is true with WWF and Greenpeace. We have, over the last 4 years, built up a very strong relationship. We know exactly where we disagree and where we agree. And the goal with the climate scores is we didn't want the discussion, should it be mandatory or not, because there it's split. The industry wants it voluntary, the NGOs want it mandatory. The NGOs don't believe that the industry will then implement it across the board. So that's this basic suspicion. But I didn't want to deal with that. I just wanted to have, we all agreed that these are in the good score, the good transparency, and then we can start to fight, should it be mandatory or voluntary, but let's just agree on these are the good indicators. And when you read all the public, the press releases from Greenpeace and WWF, they've been very supportive of the climate scores themselves. They've been very criticizing that they're voluntary, but that's their role. They should push for mandatory.
Okay, so you say one step at a time, first the framework, then we'll see, and working a little step but quicker, maybe. Maybe it's that. So I will take question now from the audience. And if you want to make any remark, please do.
So thank you very much, David. So I should perhaps say that, yes, I had the privilege to be rapporteur, which is a weird name for chair, of a group in the EU platform that worked on a task we were given about a taxonomy for significantly harmful activities and no significant impact. And what people were talking about was, brown activities. So, we decided to rethink this and think about the whole of the economy. What is the transition needed across the whole of the economy? So you already have some transition in the EU taxonomy. They're called transitional activities. So these are activities that are not low carbon, but they're so important that you still think they're making a substantial contribution to mitigation. So there's a bit of transition in the green. But then the rest of it is just not green. And then by putting the words environmentally sustainable in the taxonomy regulation, and I'm sorry if this upsets anybody, it created the impression that if you're not green, you're somehow environmentally unsustainable, which created sort of panic. And what we said in our group was, well, can we use the taxonomy and use what's there to be clearer what the rest of it is that's not green? And this might actually help investors, companies, bond issuers tell a story about the rest of the investment that's not green. And first of all, you obviously need to carve out the bit that's low environmental impact, which is about 30 to 40% of the economy, and mainly the service industry. You also have a bit of the economy that cannot transition, and we called that initially always significantly harmful, but eventually we called it activities that no technological possibility to transition to a sustainable performance level. Well, whatever. Thermal coal mining and thermal coal-fired power is an obvious example, but there are others. And the reason why you want to identify those is that's where your really big effort is needed in just transition. So by identifying them, you can actually be proactive in thinking about what is going to happen to the people and the regions that are employed in those industries. And then that leaves you with the rest of the economy. And we said, okay, so let's imagine that in some of these high-emitting sectors, green is the very top bit. And obviously you want the entities to invest to get to green, to get to lower carbon, to get to circular, to get to very good support for biodiversity as much as you can. But 90% of the economy is then left out of the discussion. So what's going on there? And actually, the EU taxonomy has a very powerful tool. It's called Do No Significant Harm. It sets criteria for significant harm. And we said, well, surely a transition away from significant harm must be really important. And we initially called that intermediate, and then we came up with the title Amber Transition. And coming back to your point on SFDR, I personally think that you could have amber transition, but somehow the guidance that's been written kind of closed the door on that. I think that could be reopened. The idea has been picked up around other parts of the world. Amber and yellow bonds are being discussed in other jurisdictions. But the really important thing about it is that you have to have clarity that not all transition is good enough. Some of it's not ambitious enough, and some of it's not fast enough. So it isn't a label for just anything. It isn't a label for improving something a bit. It is really about moving whole economies away from being not Paris-aligned or not aligned with other environmental objectives. And so even though this is a climate meeting, I'm going to use biodiversity as the example. Obviously, you want to invest sometimes in things that make a substantial contribution to biodiversity. So if you can do that, fantastic. But surely what you really also need to do is to move the whole economy to a place where it is not causing significant harm to biodiversity as well. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere. And that's why we see, of course, the situation we're in terms of biodiversity and nature collapse. And what is significant harm? Well, in the EU taxonomy, it is irreversible damage. Irreversible damage to biodiversity and nature. So if you can move whole activities, companies, etc., to a state of not doing that, that would be a super important transition. But, as you said, David, that step hasn't quite been taken in the EU, but actually it's being picked up around the world. And I would just put to the panel a question from me on, yes, I don't think we've quite got it right in the various systems, including, Christoph, dare I say it, in the Swiss one as well, because in a portfolio, you need to also say, is this improving? Because you can have in a portfolio approach, you can still be investing in thermal coal-fired power as long as you are doing some tree planting somewhere. I mean, I'm being a bit cynical, but you could. So the question to the panel is, how do we make sure that in these frameworks, we really incentivize the transition to green and climate wherever we can, but at the same time, the transition to be Paris-aligned, to be aligned with environmental goals and social goals. And how do we do that? How do we incentivize in the system those important steps? And on that question, in other words, we mustn't punish the starting point. We have to incentivize and have finance flow for the change. So that's my question to you.
I might have maybe an answer, and then it will let time to see if someone wants to take it. I think there is 2 points when we talk about transition. There is the full impact, saying, okay, we need to redirect money to green investments. I agree. But at the end, it's also a risk. So I think if we take it from the risk perspective, we have to expect regulators to take that into account for financial stability as well. So it's why I was taking the example of EBA. It's not a question of what is right, what is wrong, but it's just a question, will this financial institution be stable to make sure that we have an economy tomorrow? Not only the part about investment, but about stability itself. So I truly believe there are like these two different topics, and about regulation, at least for the EBA, is one of the topics we follow a lot. They have done a lot of a review of good practices of banks, so that's great, so we can see what is done and what is possible for others. But the results of that is now they're saying that they will strengthen the rule for capital requirements regarding transition strategy of banks. And I think it's one of the answers, is that it's amazing to incentivize. We had also the introduction yesterday about the subsidies. A huge trillion amount of money is financing fossil fuel, and that is one of the first steps we might need to do as well. And on the other side, there is also the regulation. But
I mean, I'm happy to say, and I definitely don't have the answer. I'll start off by saying that. I mean, this is obviously hugely complicated from a regulatory perspective and from a commercial perspective. I think the only thing I can offer up is, from a financial services perspective, this also seems to be a top priority. So, you know, how we get the different actors to try to create something, even if it is just the stage one. And I think what are firms worried about? They're worried about everybody has created their own transition framework based on all of the regulation and guidance that there is. But they're nervous that, you know, to your point, is that going to affect real transition? Will they then be subjected to greenwashing risk, either from a consumer perspective, a regulatory perspective, a society perspective? So look, I definitely don't have the answer because I think it is super, super complicated. But I would say that if we can get the actors together, that would, and I know that's not quick and easy, and we kind of need to be quicker and easier than we are today.
Christoph, maybe?
Yes, I would love to respond to the very good points Nancy said as well. How can we move faster? And I think I know the two big problems, but I don't yet know how to solve them. The one problem is, and I think that's research from the University of Zurich, statistically I guess it's Julian Köbel, but I'm not sure anymore, saying that investors want to invest sustainable, but as soon as there's kind of like an ESG tag to it, they feel good about it. So they're not willing to then pay more to actually have a big impact. As long as there's a small impact, they're happy. So that's one big issue where I think that a solid greenwashing framework can address. People invest in ESG funds and think they're helping to solve the world, and they have zero effect. And I think if we can make it clear that, no, sorry, dude, you don't have an impact, and if you want one, choose a different fund which is clear on the impact, that can mobilize the secondary market or the wealth management more broadly. The second issue is how, and we've talked, Nancy, you and I are in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, we've been talking about this for years. How can we mobilize, or how can we mainstream actual impact investments? They're so small compared to the rest of the wealth management. Foundations are interested in them, family offices are interested in them. How can we get the retail market, you and I, who want to have an impact, but we don't have that product offering at all? We tried this year to see if there are regulatory burdens. We came to the conclusion, unfortunately not, both on the pension fund and on the MiFID II, or the Swiss version of it. So it must be something else. Is it the liquidity? Is it the risk aversion from the chief investment officer? There's something, is it a mispricing of emerging market risk, as we heard often yesterday? Maybe it's all of the above, but we somehow need to mainstream these traditional impact investments.
Perhaps I can offer a view on this, and I think we should again take a step back, and I come to my favorite topic, fiduciary duty, and I think that's the key to unlock this, or to understand why there is not that much money flowing in impact investment as we would hope to bring about change. It's about fiduciary duty, and that most assets globally, managed assets globally, are managed with a fiduciary duty, and unless there's another mandate, these assets are managed with the objective to maximize long-term risk-adjusted returns. That sounds very hard-nosed, but it is reality. In Switzerland, for example, we have a very clear regulatory obligation for any pension fund manager to maximize long-term risk-adjusted returns. Now, climate risks are risks which have to be taken into consideration, but impact is not a metric according to which these assets are managed. So if a pension fund manager wants then to invest in impact investment, emerging markets investment, they always have to generate market returns. Now, there are these great instruments, and more are coming to the market. BlackRock had one in the market a few years ago and will come with further offerings in that space. And those are blended finance vehicles where you bring together different actors in financial services, philanthropic capital. You provide first loss guarantees. Some actors provide first loss guarantees, so that the large pool of investments can be attracted from institutional investors with a very simple mandate to maximize long-term risk-adjusted returns.
So I agree with everything what you said, but I still fundamentally disagree. So let me elaborate. So
elaborate, please.
So,
it's good. At 6:15, we start to disagree.
Pension funds are not the owners of the assets. It's you, and you. So as long as we don't have the flexibility to show our preference in investing in pension funds, that's one of the key barriers. And when it comes to wealth management, I fully agree, if you get a discretionary mandate, then there the fiduciary duty applies. But I want to go into a random bank and say I want an impact for these and these sustainability goals are important to me, and I can guarantee you I'm not getting it. I'm not getting the fund that actually has an impact. And I think there it's really about when you and I believe it's not just a generational thing. I think there's more and more people who actually want to impact with their wealth, and mostly their wealth sits in their pension funds and not in their normal saving investment accounts. And how can we ensure that there's the product range for both the pension funds and for the normal investment accounts, if I want to, that I can do.
Christopher, I think because it's so nice to disagree, it really gets me going. When we look at private investors and we look at pension funds, we observe that private investors, once things get a bit rough, they really, I mean, the very, very dark green investors, which will always hold on to their investments in impact. But overall, private investors, high net worth individuals, they're very much focused on return. And if it works with impact and sustainability, they do it. But if it doesn't work anymore, they're very quickly to divest. And then now we say all these individuals that have money and are somewhat representative of all the individuals which have their pension fund assets in their pension funds, why would they think so differently about their pension fund assets than when it's their discretionary wealth that they invest?
All I'm saying is give them the choice. They don't have the choice. And if then most of them don't do it, perfectly fine.
No, I think that's a great way to close.
The first step, at least. So, is there any other question? Yeah. So maybe just. I think the gentleman with the blue, yeah, and then on the front, and we'll continue. Yeah. I think it's behind you.
Hello. Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this democratizing impact investments, and I was a product manager for discretionary mandates at Credit Suisse, and at the time we were looking at putting in private equity into the mandates, and about 3 to 5%. Why can't, and then you have all these sustainable mandates at the moment, why can't we do a 2 to 5% allocation? It's diversified, it protects sort of, the private investor. Often banks like UBS, that we heard from Sergio, 7% of their AUM in the wealth management division is invested in sustainable mandates. And is this a regulatory reason that's blocking this? Is it fiduciary duty? They also have an impact product shelf, but for some reason they only do it with the liquid assets. Why can't we combine the two? And it seems, that's 2% of a client's portfolio, but a huge allocation if you look at the entire discretionary portfolio shelf of a bank like UBS. So, yeah, I wonder what's the problem there? And maybe Ulysse Baer, you also have a similar size of offering. What would you think to putting in the private investments into your advisory and discretionary portfolios that are managed sustainably?
Just one sentence. It's not a regulatory burden. We really check this now with many large financial institutions and also with our lawyers. It's possible as part of a very diversified portfolio to add impact investments.
I need to admit I don't know the regulatory constraints. I know within Ulysse Baer, within the mandates, the sustainability mandates, we currently do not have it. It can be with liquidity reasons, risk reasons. I don't know. We do have on the investment and the advisory side, private equity that is specifically focused on impact investment. So there is an opportunity if you want exposure to get it.
Okay, yeah.
And perhaps just to add to that, very often liquidity is the key constraint. So in these discretionary portfolios that banks manage, they need to provide the liquidity. Impact investments tend not to have that liquidity. So I think there's a huge constraint there. And with advisory, obviously you need the sign-off, special sign-off from clients to do that. So there are some constraints, but they can be overcome, of course.
I heard the couple of risk, return, liquidity. Maybe we'll come back to that. I think there was a question around here. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my question is, it seems to me that the European Commission is committed to implementing the Sustainable Finance Framework for and inclusiveness for companies of all sizes and business model. And my question will be, how are SMEs affected by the framework, and how is inclusivity ensured?
Probably I have to take this bullet, no?
Yeah, you have. I'm
Guys,
sorry.
so no, this is a very good question, and you're touching, and I want to connect it a little bit to the answer to Nancy's questions and what we can do and where I see the hope of increased money flow into the impact. So let's start with the SMEs. So SMEs are not directly subjected to the reporting directives. Those regulations are designed for larger players. But the question is, are they not really already impacted? And here we're coming to a question of spillover effect of such a large reform. So, of course, we say it's only the EU. But if I ask you guys if Switzerland is not impacted by this reform, probably it is. And not only Switzerland, US companies are subject to this, to those reporting standards by the fact that they have some exposures here and they're trying to sell some financial products here. And so are SMEs through different ways. One is that the larger companies who have suppliers are subject to CS-DDD directive, which forces you to force your suppliers to start reporting all those data points for them to do business with, right? Because those large companies will need that data from their suppliers to construct their own answers to all the reporting that they need to fulfill. So SMEs are impacted today. And of course, we're talking about the sector that creates 95% of the economy of the European Union. So SMEs are a very important part of the equation. And the role of the regulators here is to simplify the framework so that it's not extremely costly for those companies to comply with those requirements, but not leaving them behind. And I can assure you that actually in the platform and with the Commission, there are a lot of bodies representing SMEs and making sure that those criteria for them will be implemented in a reasonable and manageable manner. And now, answering your question, Nancy, I believe that putting aside the large pools of institutional money, pension funds, and I think that Miriam and Christoph covered this discussion very, very well. But personally, I believe that the massive push will come through retail. And the retail customers will be the ones who will be voting with their money. And this can amass to a larger pools of very loyal and long-term investing finance. Just a little plug, here we are trying to build a tool that will enable, together with Sustainable Finance Geneva, a marketplace for exactly such a products. Small and medium enterprises also outside of Europe, to bring them, help them enlist on Swiss-based stock exchanges to enable and democratize access of the individual investor to allow them to invest in those assets. Obviously, this is a small drop in a large pool, but I believe that retail will be a game changer here.
Thank you.
Can I add to the SME comment?
Of course.
So in banking, so this is like the non-regulatory side, right? We do see a huge focus in the banking sector on SME transition. To your point, it's a huge part of most countries' economy, and therefore it's normally a huge part of most banks' book of business. And I think the sort of stage that they're at the moment is very much helping them to understand their GHG emissions and then trying to help them to understand how to change. I think there's a lot of mistrust, not just with the banks, but with the technologies, with the transition, with the cost of doing it. You know, if I move to EV, is it then going to be hydrogen? If I move to that electricity supplier, is something else? So again, I think it's a journey, but we see in every single market, the UK government is, sorry, the UK Bankers for Net Zero is currently working on an SME portal to capture GHG emissions. And when I've discussed this with other countries, they'll be like, oh yeah, great, we want that as well. So I think, and it goes back to another comment, so I think the banks are trying to do something. But then I know the Dutch Assistant Prime Minister yesterday also mentioned what governments do, because if governments ask all of their providers to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, then that typically would automatically pull into scope a whole bunch of SMEs. And just forcing them to do something is probably going to be too expensive and too difficult. So then thinking about not just help from the banks, but other parts of the economy and how you just get them to realize what they're facing and help them make some sensible choices over the next kind of 10, 20 years.
I will maybe just add one comment on that. In the group I'm working with, Carbon 4, we are working since 15 years on climate, and we help a lot of companies, huge companies, but also small and medium. And actually, they are quite the most innovative company we are working with. So usually when a lot of people ask us, do you believe that a huge corporation will move faster or slower than small one? Actually, the small ones are very innovative. They are maybe also the leaders of tomorrow in certain sector. And I think it's also what we need to keep in mind is that some of them are willing to do the chance because they know that it might be a good opportunity for them. So we are working also on that topic on how can we, through financial sectors, help SMEs to understand their risk and also to act. But I think there is a need of solidarity, like between all stakeholders, between financial actors, huge corporations and their stakeholders' values to make sure we all move forward on the good direction. I will let the question of the other gentleman with the blue jacket, if you still have your question, I don't know. Yeah? I didn't forget you.
It's very kind, thank you. Actually, I was following very much the wealth and investment management responses. So, as Miriam said, it's very important for us to have good risk-adjusted returns. It's very important. But could we say that we incentivize clients to invest in good adjusted returns with an objective of low carbon, for instance? And how do you do this, if you do this, in your organizations? It goes to Julius Baer too. Thank you.
I think it's a very tricky question, because if you have seen how the green energy has been doing over the past years and the returns on the fossil fuel, it is a very difficult story. So you need to have clients that are fully dedicated believers. But in the long run, we need to be aware of the risks from the transition, and we can explain that to a client. Of course, fossil fuel is doing great now, but we cannot keep relying on fossil fuel. So at a certain point, your fossil fuel deposits might become obsolete. And then you do have financial issues. So we need to explain to the client also the longer term view and be aware that, yes, currently a harmful investment might be very profitable. We need to also look into the long run.
Yeah, I probably would add to that. It's about long-term risk-adjusted returns, and with institutional clients, it's usually very clear that they have a long-term investment horizon. And with private clients, this can differ very much, and they can be much more short-term oriented. But I think it's important to explain to all investors that the transition is not a straight line. It's not going like that. It's kind of a very bumpy road, and I think geopolitical risks that materialized, war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, etc., this makes for a very bumpy road for investors, and there are times when fossil fuel assets do very well, coal is coming back, but over the long term, as we're going towards that 2050 net zero or low carbon targets, then there's no way around renewables, and eventually we will have to phase out of coal and fossil fuels overall. And you know, we had the stranded asset discussion a couple of years ago when coal lost 90% of its value. Nobody speaks about stranded assets anymore right now, but I can assure you this will come back. So it's that bumpy road. Investors need to prepare for that, but keep the long-term objective in mind. And I think a portfolio which has these transition assets and companies which are ready for that transition and follow a transitioning and decarbonizing path are probably the best insurance and future-proofing for a portfolio.
Thank you very much. I will just make a last remark. It rings a bell for me when we talk about the couple of risk and return. We work with the bank BPC, so it might not be relevant maybe for big indexes, but maybe for bank if you are working in the bank industry. So what they have done since 5 years ago is to do their own framework of RWA, so their risk-weighted adjustment. So it's a little number that allow you to calculate the cost of capital. And today, there is no, actually, at my knowledge, no regulation that tell you to adjust with climate risk systematically your RWA. What they have done, it's an analytical RWA, so it means that each time they need to decide if or not they are going to finance a company. At the credit committee level decision, they calculate the true RWA and the RWA with a bonus-malus system. So they have the normal RWA calculated with the rating with financial risk, and they allocate a percentage bonus-malus with our rating, saying, okay, if they are maybe going in the right direction, maybe it's worth to say that maybe the cost of capital will be cheaper, and vice versa. And what we have seen, the most interesting part, it's not the way they have done it, but it's the way that the team have learned with it. It means that now each senior banker have to understand the rating, have to understand why and how the rating is done, to explain to the corporate why maybe the financing rate is higher or lower. And I think that's also another way, waiting for maybe a new framework or new regulation to be creative in the meantime and not waiting too much.
Yeah, but maybe it's, and don't want to spoil this, but it's not necessarily always the regulation. I think when we think about listed banks who have, which have huge exposure to climate risks in their credit portfolios, this is not appreciated by the capital markets. So they have a very big incentive, to keep that number low and also transition out of those high carbon credit portfolios, or sunset these, as a banker said the other day. I love that, sunset these assets, these exposures. And so I think the capital markets are very effective today as they bring the future into the present when you think about the discounted cash flows of the future, and they bring those risks of the future into the day and are reflected in the valuation. So I think it's regulation on the other hand, at one hand, capital markets on the other hand, and I think together that's a very effective instrument to drive the transition.
So I will now conclude this session. I have begun with 3 points, and I still believe that they are quite relevant, but maybe I will adjust it. I still believe that we are not at the right speed, but we can definitely speed up together. We cannot reinvent our planet boundaries, but we can definitely reinvent a lot of stuff, as we have discussed today. And be brave and bold, and we have seen that it's already the case. Thank you very much.